War of the Conquest: The Killing of Indigenous People by Trey Knowles. Note: all of North America was indigenous people of different tribes: Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy. How many people of these tribes are left today? The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, was a theater of the 7 Years' War, which pitted the North American colonies of the British Empire against those of the French, each side being supported by various Native American tribes. At the start of the war, the French colonies had a population of roughly 60,000 settlers, compared with 2 million in the British colonies. The outnumbered French particularly depended on their native allies. 2 years into the war, in 1756, Great Britain declared war on France, beginning the worldwide 7 Years' War. Many view the French and Indian War as being merely the American theater of this conflict. However, in the United States, the French and Indian War is viewed as a singular conflict which was not associated with any European war. 7 French Canadians call it the Guerre de la Conquête, War of the Conquest. The British colonists were supported at various times by the Iroquois, Catawba, and Cherokee tribes, and the French colonists were supported by Wabanaki Confederacy members Abenaki and Mi'kmaq, and the Algonquin, Lenape, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Shawnee, and Wyandot, Huron. Fighting took place primarily along the frontiers between New France and the British colonies, from the province of Virginia in the south to Newfoundland in the north. It began with a dispute over control of the confluence of the Allegheny River and Monongahela River called the Forks of the Ohio, and the site of the French Fort Duquesne, at the location that later became Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The dispute erupted into violence in the Battle of Jumonville Glen in May 1754, during which Virginia militiamen under the command of 22-year-old George Washington ambushed a French patrol. In 1755, 6 colonial governors met with General Edward Braddock, the newly arrived British Army commander, and planned a 4-way attack on the French. None succeeded, and the main effort by Braddock proved a disaster. He lost the Battle of the Monongahela on July 9, 1755, and died a few days later. British operations failed in the frontier areas of the province of Pennsylvania and the province of New York during 1755–57 due to a combination of poor management, internal divisions, effective Canadian scouts, French regular forces, and native warrior allies. In 1755, the British captured Fort Beausejour on the border separating Nova Scotia from Acadia, and they ordered the expulsion of the Acadians, 1755–64, soon afterwards. Orders for the deportation were given by Commander-in-Chief William Shirley, without direction from Great Britain. The Acadians were expelled, both those captured in arms and those who had sworn the loyalty oath to the king. Natives likewise were driven off the land to make way for settlers from New England. The British Pitt government fell due to disastrous campaigns in 1757, including a failed expedition against Louisbourg and the siege of Fort William Henry. This last was followed by the natives torturing and massacring their colonial victims. William Pitt came to power and significantly increased British military resources in the colonies at a time when France was unwilling to risk large convoys to aid the limited forces that they had in New France, preferring to concentrate their forces against Prussia and its allies who were now engaged in the 7 Years' War in Europe. The conflict in Ohio ended in 1758 with the British American victory in the Ohio Country. Between 1758 and 1760, the British military launched a campaign to capture French Canada. They succeeded in capturing territory in surrounding colonies and ultimately the city of Quebec, 1759. The following year, the British were victorious in the Montreal Campaign, in which the French ceded Canada in accordance with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. France also ceded its territory east of the Mississippi to Great Britain, as well as French Louisiana west of the Mississippi River to its ally Spain in compensation for Spain's loss to Great Britain of Spanish Florida. Spain had ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for the return of Havana, Cuba. France's colonial presence north of the Caribbean was reduced to the islands of Saint Pierre and Miquelon, confirming Great Britain's position as the dominant colonial power in Northern America. In British America, wars were often named after the sitting British monarch, such as King William's War or Queen Anne's War. There had already been a King George's War in the 1740s during the reign of King George II. so British colonists named this conflict after their opponents, and it became known as the French and Indian War. This continues as the standard name for the war in the United States, although indigenous peoples fought on both sides of the conflict. It also led into the 7 Years' War overseas, a much larger conflict between France and Great Britain that did not involve the American colonies. Some historians make a connection between the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War overseas, but most residents of the United States consider them as two separate conflicts, only one of which involved the American colonies, and American historians generally use the traditional name. Less frequently used names for the war include the Fourth Intercolonial War and the Great War for the Empire. In Europe, the French and Indian War is conflated into the 7 Years' War and not given a separate name. 7 years refers to events in Europe from the official declaration of war in 1756, 2 years after the French and Indian War had started, to the signing of the peace treaty in 1763. The French and Indian War in America, by contrast, was largely concluded in 6 years from the Battle of Jumonville Glen in 1754 to the capture of Montreal in 1760. Canadians conflate both the European and American conflicts into the 7 Years' War, Guerre de Septembre Année. French Canadians also use the term War of Conquest, Guerre de la Conquête, since it is the war in which New France was conquered by the British and became part of the British Empire. In Quebec, this term was promoted by popular historians Jacques Lacourcière and Denis Vogiois, who borrowed from the ideas of Maurice Seguin in considering this war as a dramatic tipping point of French-Canadian identity and nationhood. At this time, North America east of the Mississippi River was largely claimed by either Great Britain or France. Large areas had no colonial settlements. The French population numbered about 75,000 and was heavily concentrated along the St. Lawrence River Valley, with some also in Acadia, present-day New Brunswick, and parts of Nova Scotia, including Isle Royale, Cape Breton Island. Fewer lived in New Orleans, Biloxi, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, and small settlements in the Illinois country, hugging the east side of the Mississippi River and its tributaries. French fur traders and trappers traveled throughout the St. Lawrence and Mississippi watersheds, did business with local Indian tribes, and often married Indian women. Traders married daughters of chiefs, creating high-ranking unions. British settlers outnumbered the French 20-1 with a population of about 1.5 million ranged along the Atlantic coast of the continent from Nova Scotia and the colony of Newfoundland in the north to the province of Georgia in the south. Many of the older colonies' land claims extended arbitrarily far to the west, as the extent of the continent was unknown at the time when their provincial charters were granted. Their population centers were along the coast, but the settlements were growing into the interior. The British captured Nova Scotia from France in 1713, which still had a significant French-speaking population. Britain also claimed Rupert's Land, where the Hudson's Bay Company traded for furs with local Indian tribes. Between the French and British colonists, large areas were dominated by Indian tribes. To the north, the Mi'kmaq and the Abenakis were engaged in Father Le Loutre's War and still held sway in parts of Nova Scotia, Acadia, and the eastern portions of the province of Canada, as well as much of Maine. The Iroquois Confederation dominated much of upstate New York and the Ohio country, although Ohio also included Algonquian-speaking populations of Delaware and Shawnee, as well as Iroquoian-speaking Mingos. These tribes were formally under Iroquois rule and were limited by them in their authority to make agreements. The Iroquois Confederation initially held a stance of neutrality to ensure continued trade with both French and British. Though maintaining this stance proved difficult, as the Iroquois Confederation tribes sided and supported French or British causes, depending on which side provided the most beneficial trade. The southeast interior was dominated by Siouan-speaking Catawbas, Muskogee-speaking Creeks and Choctaw, and the Iroquoian-speaking Cherokee tribes. When war broke out, the French colonists used their trading connections to recruit fighters from tribes in western portions of the Great Lakes region, which was not directly subject to the conflict between the French and British. These included the Hurons, Mississaugas, Ojibways, Winnebagos, and Potawatomi. The British colonists were supported in the war by the Iroquois Six Nations and also by the Cherokees, until differences sparked the Anglo-Cherokee War in 1758. In 1758, the province of Pennsylvania successfully negotiated the Treaty of Easton, in which a number of tribes in the Ohio country promised neutrality in exchange for land concessions and other considerations. Most of the other northern tribes sided with the French, their primary trading partner and supplier of arms. The Creeks and Cherokees were subject to diplomatic efforts by both the French and British to gain either their support or neutrality in the conflict. At this time, Spain claimed only the province of Florida in eastern America. It controlled Cuba and other territories in the West Indies that became military objectives in the 7 Years' War. Florida's European population was a few hundred, concentrated in St. Augustine. There were no French regular army troops stationed in America at the onset of war. New France was defended by about 3,000 troops de la Marine, companies of colonial regulars, some of whom had significant woodland combat experience. The colonial government recruited militia support when needed. The British had few troops. Most of the British colonies mustered local militia companies to deal with Indian threats, generally ill-trained and available only for short periods, but they did not have any standing forces. Virginia, by contrast, had a large frontier with several companies of British regulars. When hostilities began, the British colonial governments preferred operating independently of one another and of the government in London. This situation complicated negotiations with Indian tribes, whose territories often encompass land claimed by multiple colonies. As the war progressed, the leaders of the British Army establishment tried to impose constraints and demands on the colonial administrations.